Welcome, everybody. This is the panel on the discussion about the current status of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and the future of commercialization. Delighted to have a robust panel here. As Phil had mentioned, this will be airing on the Sunday the 6th, pre the temple burn, the K-Dome, or the Microdome on the Infinite Playa. So I think we can expect everyone here to be in full avatar watching this presentation.
Full avatar, I know that expression.
And the purpose is to, as Phil had alluded to at the beginning, discuss the future of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and specifically the coming commercialization. And I think the result that I'd like to produce is leave people with an understanding of how do we shepherd the expansion, the access to care without diluting the quality of care. And I'd like to organize the discussion into 4 parts for the audience. First is a general overview of what's happening today with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. The second is what's the current status of the political or regulatory environment? What are the headwinds and potential tailwinds to the extent we have them? The third is, what are the range of business models that we see emerging? And how do we make sure that there are appropriate standards of care embedded in that? And then finally, a wrap up with how people can help. So with that, I'd start with an introduction. My name is Seth Taube. I'm a 25+ year investor. I'm delighted to have joined the board of the Ketamine Research Foundation last year with Phil Wilson, and also on the board of the Awakened Medicine Foundation, both focused on research as well as training and the effective delivery of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And I'd ask, maybe we'll start with Phil, since you were organizing this wonderful panel, if you would just introduce yourself and share your experience so far.
Well, I'm honored to be with you and so glad to be doing this, because I think it's central to how we look at where we're going, what we're doing. And there are diverse tendencies. I don't have any illusion that we're going to come out of this with a unification, other than, I hope, a unity around the beneficial aspects of providing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, which has been my passion since the 80s when I met Rick at Esalen and throughout, and Sasha and that whole crowd of people. My life's been divided between being a practitioner, and which I could continue to do, mostly focused now on ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, but also a participant in nonprofit organizations. Rick was my benefactor in helping us to organize and complete a study of anxiety in individuals with a year or less to live a life-threatening illness with MDMA, which hopefully will be published in the next few weeks. I hope to loud acclaim, because it is groundbreaking in that way. And I've organized the Ketamine Research Foundation in the last 3.5 years or so to explore the breadth of the potentialities of ketamine as an assisted psychotherapy. It's the niche that we've developed, and written a book about it, and I'm promoting its training and education so that it serves as a foundation in the toolbox that we're building with MDMA, psilocybin, hopefully ayahuasca, and other substances that are so valuable to benefit human beings, especially in assisted psychotherapy modalities, though I also have great respect for what it has done as medicines in the underground, which I call the ground, because all of us come from the ground and then work our way to the surface. And here we are at the surface, okay. So that's sort of my spiel, recognizing that trauma is upon us. I mean, I've been weeping all day for the family who lost their father, who was shot and killed in front of his 3 kids in Wisconsin. That kind of trauma is just unacceptable. And it's everywhere. We're in the midst of fires in California. So within our foundation, recognizing the limitations of what we can provide as assisted psychotherapy, because we haven't trained enough people, we're doing a thing called Indra's Net Coalition as a worldwide trauma facilitated group experience. I hope you'll look at it. So I'm pleased to be here. I'm pleased to have taken a role in bringing us together. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And Rick, I would like you to introduce yourself as well. And thank you very much. Enjoyed your most recent Wall Street Journal article.
Yeah, that was an amazing accomplishment that we were able to raise $30 million in the midst of a financial crisis and global pandemic, and do it all through Zoom mostly. So I guess I was very much motivated at age 18 to look at the world and feel scared. You know, I was in one of the last years of the lottery for Vietnam. I was educated on the stories of the Holocaust, and grew up during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and just realized that humanity as a whole is not really sane. We're destroying the planet, we're destroying each other, we're developing new weapons of mass destruction. You know, Albert Einstein said, our technology has exceeded our humanity. So 1972, at age 18, after reading Stan Grof's work about his LSD research, and then realizing that it had all been shut down, I thought it was one way to try to contribute to a mentally healthy world, to try to bring back psychedelic research and become a psychedelic therapist myself, and also, and not least, to go through psychedelic therapy myself. And I did that, but I was unprepared for that, and I overemphasized the number of drugs you take, and I underemphasized the integration process. And so I basically had to take 10 years to get grounded, to build things in the world physically. And then 82 is back when I started looking at psychedelics again as a main thing, as a student again, as a freshman in college. And that's where I went back to study with Stan Grof and learned about MDMA. And so I learned about MDMA before the backlash. So in 82, it was already a secret underground therapy drug, but it was also being sold as ecstasy, as a party drug. So it was during Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan and escalation of the drug war, and it was clear it was doomed. And so that's where I decided to get more politically involved, and started a nonprofit, Earth Metabolic Design Lab, in 84, to prepare for when the DEA moved to criminalize MDMA, because we had the opportunity to introduce a whole bunch of people to it when it was legal, and then we were sort of preparing our witnesses, preparing our testimony, which we wouldn't have been able to do after it was attempted to be criminalized. And so we reached out to all different people, and summer of 84, the DEA moved to criminalize MDMA, and then we filed for administrative law judge hearing with the DEA. We were winning in the court of public opinion, winning in the courts. The DEA freaked out. In 85, they emergency scheduled MDMA. Turns out that that was an illegal move on their part. They didn't have the authority to do that, but we didn't know that at the time. Eventually, we won the case. The DEA administrative law judge said, yes, it should be a medicine. It should be illegal for recreational use, but it should be Schedule III. And the DEA rejected the recommendation. In 86, I started MAPS as a nonprofit pharma to try to bring back psychedelics, particularly MDMA, through the FDA. I was fortunately unaware that no drug had ever been made into a medicine by a nonprofit, which didn't happen until 1999, the abortion pill. And a similar story, controversial drug, abandoned by the pharmaceutical companies. Nobody in the government was going to fund it. And so it was private philanthropies through the Rockefellers, the Buffetts, and the Pritzkers and others that brought RU46. So in any case, it started MAPS in 86, took us till 92 to get some meetings at the FDA where they decided to open the door to psychedelic research. They had first approved Rick Strassman to do DMT research in 1990, but that was kind of a negative study in the sense that he was positing that it could cause schizophrenia. And so sort of looking at the risks, maybe DMT released in the brain would cause schizophrenia. So in 92, I went with Charlie Grobe and we wanted to do MDMA with cancer patients, the study that Phil eventually was able to do. And the FDA and NIDA had some meetings and they decided to open the door to psychedelic research. And that was the fundamental change in 1992. And then through the 90s, Charlie and I worked on the study with a phase 1 dose response safety study. FDA said we had to start where we would normally start with any other drug, even though there was all this information from the underground use before even when it was legal. We knew a lot about it, but we had to do it all under FDA. So it took us till the end of the 90s, and then Charlie started realizing that the controversy over ecstasy as a party drug and the controversy over neurotoxicity just kept growing and growing. And so he wanted to switch to psilocybin instead. And so that ended up starting the psilocybin cancer patient research and the psilocybin depression anxiety studies. I had worked with a patient with PTSD in 1984, and that's where I knew that MDMA was great for PTSD. And so in 1990, Michael Mithofer came to me and he said he wanted to build an offshore clinic for psychedelics. He'd been down to St. Kitts where Deborah Mash had been giving Ibogaine to people for opiate addictions. And I said, I have no interest in that. I want to go from the heart of the beast, start from the inside out. And so within 10 minutes, we decided that we would work on MDMA for PTSD. And then it took us 16 years to 2016 to have our end of phase 2 meeting with FDA. And we learned a bunch of stuff in phase 2, basically that it worked regardless of the cause of PTSD, that we could demonstrate safety. We had early signals of efficacy. And so we went to the FDA and they said, yes, we could go to phase 3. And then we raised $34 million. And then I was, again, diluted. I thought that was going to be enough. And turns out budgets increased. And so we negotiated with FDA to have what's called a special protocol assessment agreement. It took us 8 months, and FDA came to agreement with us on the design and everything else that they'd need. So we have a legally binding agreement with FDA on they will approve the drug if we get statistically significant evidence of efficacy from 2 phase 3 studies and if no new safety problems arise. And I don't think that'll happen because there's just an enormous amount of information we know about the safety already. Then FDA declared it a breakthrough therapy, and that was tremendous. That gave us more meetings with FDA and kind of a signal that the FDA considered it very promising. And we have now completed our first phase 3 study. We had the interim analysis in March that was terrific. We didn't have to add anybody. We have a 90% or greater probability of statistical significance once the whole study was done. Last 2 Fridays ago, we got the last data point. And so before the end of September, we're going to know if our first study was statistically significant. We've already started the second study. And we're also moving to globalize in Europe. And as you mentioned, Seth, we've just completed a $30 million fundraise. And that'll get us the data that we need to submit to the FDA. If FDA says yes, then Israel and Canada will say yes as well, because we have 2 sites in Israel, 2 in Canada, and 11 throughout the United States. And we're just starting up in 7 countries in Europe to train the Europeans. And I'll just say that we're doing it in a nonprofit context, but I realized that I needed a different story to tell to donors because we were asking for so much money. And the story was that if we make MDMA into a medicine, we will sell it for a profit. And we will use the profits to reinvest in more research. And we can't do that inside the nonprofit. It's taxable. And so we needed to create a new vehicle. And in the December 2014, we created the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. So that's a for-profit company, and it is designed to maximize public benefit over profit. And it's 100% owned by the nonprofit. So we have a nonprofit that owns a for-profit, and the nonprofit, and I'd like to acknowledge Ethan and all the work that he's done. It's really about mainstreaming these drugs, not just in medicine, but in a post-prohibition world. So we're both trying to medicalize and at the same time trying to make it so people don't have to buy MDMA from us, that they could get it on their own, and we want to teach them how to do it. And eventually what I think is going to happen is we're going to have thousands of psychedelic clinics, and the therapists all want to be cross-trained. So they'll be trained, as Phil was saying, they'll be trained in ketamine and MDMA and psilocybin, and they'll eventually be able to customize the treatments per the individual. And I think that's really what we're hoping to see. And we're very much sympathetic with the for-profit approach. I don't think that the for-profit approach is evil or bad. I just think that if you look at American healthcare, it's warped all out of recognition by the profit motive. And it's, so I'm concerned about profit maximization. And I think a good example is what happened with Johnson & Johnson and Jensen with ketamine, where they maximize profit, but not patient benefit, because first off, they don't administer ketamine with therapy, so you end up needing more ketamine. If you administer with therapy, you get better results, but you might not need as much ketamine. So I'm concerned about the for-profit model, but I think that we need it. And hopefully we'll have discussions here today about how we moderate the profit maximization and keep into account that humanity needs these tools, needs this grounding, needs this spirituality, needs healing of trauma, and that's collectively a bigger need than maximizing profit.
Thank you, Rick, and congratulations. Ethan, thank you, welcome, and thanks for all of your work on drug policy and everything that you've done. I think it'd be useful in your introduction to touch on the current, your views on the current policy and regulatory environment as well. And
Sure.
Or and more importantly, what are the actually tailwinds that we might see, not just the headwinds?
Yeah, and as I said to Phil when he invited me, I'm not an expert in this area, but I can maybe just give a sense of some broader perspective. I've been involved in drug policy reform, and drug policy really since the 80s. I started off writing a dissertation and a book on internationalization of criminal law enforcement, and got myself a security clearance and worked in the State Department's Narcotics Bureau, and was interviewing drug enforcement agents all around South America and Europe at the same time that Rick was tangling with them back in the mid-80s. And then went and taught at Princeton, started teaching at Princeton in the public policy school and politics department in the late 80s, and started speaking out and writing about why the war on drugs and the overall prohibitionist framework was fundamentally misguided, and that we needed to understand that most of the harms associated with drugs were not the result of drug misuse, but even more so the result of failed prohibitionist policy. And so, first as an academic and writing, and then having the good fortune in the summer of '92 to get a phone call out of the blue from a little-known philanthropist at the time named George Soros. And so I left Princeton and started up first an activist think tank called the Lindisman Center in '94. And then in 2000, spun that out of Soros' thing, merged it with the Drug Policy Foundation, which was a membership-based organization to create Drug Policy Alliance. And then really spent from 2000 to 2017 building that into probably the leading organization advocating for broad-based drug policy reform in the US and to some extent around the world. And when I say drug policy reform, I would say just a few things about that. In terms of what we focused on, 1/3 of the work roughly was marijuana reform, which meant, reducing marijuana arrests, decriminalizing marijuana, legalizing it for medical uses, and then legalizing it more broadly for adults. The second third was ending the role of the drug war in mass incarceration. It had been the drug war which drove that increase in mass incarceration in the 80s, 90s, into the aughts. And then similarly, drug policy reform became the cutting edge of sentencing reform and criminal justice reform in the late 90s and until about, the area started to expand some years ago. And the last third was harm reduction, right? About, understanding that drugs and drug use and misuse should be treated primarily as a health issue, and that we should focus on reducing the harms of both drug use and drug policies, whether it's opioids or stimulants or legal drugs or what have you, needle exchange, overdose prevention, honest drug education, teaching Americans about European approaches. Psychedelics was only ever a very small part of our agenda, in part because I thought that Rick, with MAPS, was doing such an outstanding job, and you had others like Hefter and other organizations out there doing it. So we kept a finger in on that stuff and would ally with MAP occasionally. And I was very appreciative of the fact that, whereas some of the folks in the psychedelics area were keeping broader drug policy reform at arm's length, Rick and MAPS were really very much keen to be part of the broader drug policy reform movement. It's the same thing I appreciate about Ben Delonen and ICEERS, the ayahuasca organization, taking a very similar perspective and not being fearful about being associated with drug policy reform. When I would speak at psychedelics gatherings, part of what I would do would be, in part, talk about the importance to understand that even though many of us can recognize that psychedelics and to some extent cannabis have a much greater benefit cost ratio relative to other drugs like the opioids and stimulants and cocaine, at the same time, the fundamental principle of sovereignty over our own minds and bodies and recognizing the harms of prohibiting substances, even those which have a high risk potential, is not something that should be done. And so really kind of, really for decades now, trying to speak against psychedelic exceptionalism, recognizing the exceptional value and specialness of these things, but understanding that just as the First Amendment applies not just to elevated speech, but even to debased speech, because we need to protect all of it, as people in the psychedelics field should appreciate the same, right? As I understand it, the principal benefits of commercialization and the venture capital investment is that it's going to significantly increase the amount of money available for moving forward with studies and approval of these substances and treatments around the world, right? That there's only so much Rick and other philanthropists can do in raising this money, even with the public benefit corporations. So there will, in fact, accelerate and expand the number of legal uses and legal substances because of venture capital money. On the other hand, it seems readily apparent that any time that you have the sort of, capitalist energies and for-profit investments, even if those are initiated by people who have been profoundly healed or transformed by their own MDMA or psychedelics use, ultimately they're accountable to investors and shareholders and what have you, and the basic profit motivation. And that is, as Rick and others have said, inevitably corrupting, inevitably problematic in all sorts of ways. And I think the stuff, some of the models that Phil has laid out and some of the stuff that MAPS has laid out lays that out. And the third point in all of this is that we live in a predominantly capitalist world. I mean, it's not capitalism versus socialism. It's capitalism's quasi-free market and crony capitalism versus the Chinese state-based capitalism model. That there's essentially no getting away from it. And that capitalism and investment is inevitably going to find its money. And so the question is not, do we oppose it, but in fact, how do we basically adapt a harm reduction model to the role of for-capital finance in this whole field? How do we maximize the benefits of for-profit investing and minimize the downside? And if I'm asked to look at what perspectives I can bring from the fields I've been involved in, I mean, obviously with cannabis, one can see the Wild West that's going on, all of this stuff happening. Maybe in the discussion later on, I can bring a few more insights to bear on this. But we basically felt that the criminalization of cannabis was fundamentally problematic. 3/4 million people being arrested in this country, millions around the world. Issues around quality and control, organized crime, blah 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 blah. All the evils of prohibition, as with alcohol prohibition. But the downside of legalization would be to push out many of the smaller producers, the smaller growers, put it into the hands of big capital, big investors who had never felt any connection to this area in the first place. And the question of how to balance that. Remember, we were drafting the California legalization initiative in 2016. We wanted to make sure, for example, that the sanctions on people who continue to grow illegally remain fairly modest, even though that was going to complicate the transition to broader legalization regulation. So there's issues like that. And then, of course, in the other area, here we're pushing against the prohibition or outright prohibition, punitive prohibition with drugs like heroin. But when you looked at what the pharmaceutical companies were doing with legal opioids and the ways in which the Purdue Pharmas and Johnson & Johnsons and the drug manufacturers and distributors were pushing these opioid medications that were miracle drugs for people dealing with, intense, sudden, post-operative pain, burn pain, things like that, but we're pushing them out there to maximize profits to use for chronic pain, where the risk-benefit ratio was very high on the risk-harm side and low on the benefit side. So I'm fully aware of the evils of a sort of uninhibited or exploitative capitalist approach. So when it comes to the psychedelics, on this panel, I'm really much more ears wanting to hear how all of you are thinking about these issues of kind of, adopting, if you agree with this formulation, a harm reduction approach to the commercialization, the inevitable commercialization of psychedelics.
Thank you so much. And Liana, welcome. We're giving introductions, and I thought apropos of your expertise in fundraising and understanding where money comes from for this, as we look carefully at the introduction of for-profit models, I thought as you introduce yourself, I thought that would be interesting. I know you have strong opinions about that, so welcome.
Well, first of all, I just want to say hi and thank you. I apologize for being late. I was at a standing Monday meeting. I am Liana Gillooly. Rick, it's good to see you. I work with Rick at MAPS on fundraising, and I also have a background working for a group called the ArcView Group, which became the largest investor network in the cannabis industry. And it was started by two activists and advocates who really saw that having a responsible, sustainable, and profitable cannabis industry could lead to law change. And that thesis very much proved out. And at the same time, I can remember the days early on at ArcView versus the later days of my time there, and just witnessing the entire makeup of the industry change. Witnessing how people who were involved early on understood the context of the war on drugs that Ethan was just speaking so eloquently to. They had a direct relationship with the plant. They had direct experiences with the plant. So all these concerns and considerations led to the formation of another nonprofit called North Star, which I've been working on now with a group of people for about a year. We launched back in April, and the entire mission and purpose of North Star is to raise the floor and to generate a culture of ethics and integrity within the emergent field of business and psychedelics. And one thing I want to point out is none of this happens without having vision and mission aligned capital, without having investors willing to put their money behind entrepreneurs who might be doing things a little bit differently, might be throwing the big pharma business as usual playbook kind of out the window. And I'm really inspired to say that there's an evolution happening in finance and funding in general right now. This has been evidenced primarily in the clean energy movement, and we're seeing moves towards company structures such as stakeholder corporations and cooperative ownership. We're seeing investment models such as capped return investment models. We're seeing long-term, thinking around some of these things, having a longer horizon rather than quarterly reporting. So we're starting to see a shift in investment in general. And I think my whole goal with North Star and the people I'm working at on that project with is to really highlight that we don't have to just employ the business as usual model if we're going to be doing business in psychedelics, and asking these really big questions around what a psychedelic business can look and act and feel like. And I think that psychedelic culture has had an outsized impact on global culture in general. And I'm curious to see if some of these businesses can really do things differently, what kind of impact that can have on business and finance and investing in general. So that's just like a basic overview. I'm happy to go into more details, but as I'm arriving late, I don't want to just keep talking. So thanks.
Thank you. And interesting, I think, Ronan, if you would take a turn, I know that you've been involved in both the early marijuana and then now increasingly in psychedelics. So it'd be interesting to hear your take as you introduce yourself on some of the concerns that have been raised and how you're dealing with them.
Sure. So, hey, everybody, I'm Ronan Levy. I'm executive chairman of Field Trip. Just a little bit of background about me. I'll try and keep it brief, but outside of my work in cannabis and now psychedelics, I've done probably 15 years of like deep internal work, and probably contrary to most people in the psychedelics industry, I don't think that psychedelics are necessary to the future human evolution. I think we all have the capacity to do this work ourselves without the need for drugs to accelerate it. I just think the drugs are potentially a great way to catalyze it. So I think I stand as a little bit of an outlier to some people on this, having done a lot of work by myself without drugs, because I actually grew up straight edge. I didn't drink, I didn't use cannabis, I didn't use any drugs until much later in life. But I do see the potential associated with these molecules to really expedite things. I'm a lawyer by training, and that really informs, I think, a lot of my perspectives. I've become fairly libertarian in my old age, so to speak, not because I take the view that regulation is bad, but I find that crafting precise regulation is virtually impossible. And it always creates unintended side effects that just create new problems. And that's where I kind of end up leaning with, let's have a lot of respect for an individual's person to make decisions, informed decisions, and leave it there, which is why a lot of the things that have been said so far resonate with me in terms of personal autonomy. My entry into this sphere generally was about 5 years ago when myself and the other co-founders actually of Field Trip started a company called Canadian Cannabis Clinic. We opened the first legally compliant medical cannabis clinic in Canada. CCC has grown and is still the largest network of cannabis specialized medical clinics. Came in solely from an entrepreneurial perspective, had no particular attachment or affiliation with cannabis, but generally believed that the war on drugs was misguided. And so if our clinics did nothing except give people legal access to cannabis and prevented them from going to jail, that was worthwhile. Just so turns out that our clinics and our physicians and cannabis medicine have a profound impact on, and I apologize if you hear noise in the background, my 4-year-old is over there. And so if we need to move him out, let me know. But we're blown away by how profoundly impactful cannabis medicine was for our patients. And that really opened our eyes, even though we came in from an agnostic perspective. We ended up selling that business. We're actively involved in the growth of the Canadian medical and now recreational cannabis industry. And then about 2.5 years ago, left to pursue something new, which is when we learned about the work that Rick and MAPS was doing. Michael Pollan's book had just come out, and so we dug deep into it. It was something that, through my personal work, something I naturally gravitated towards when someone once described a psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy session as being like 10 years of therapy in a single session. So it's something that I gravitated towards. And that's when we launched into what is now Field Trip. I think we spoke to Rick fairly early on in our development, understood the need for a new clinical infrastructure to deliver this kind of care, which dovetailed nicely with our work in Canadian cannabis clinics. And that's where it really started with Field Trip. The questions, and now Field Trip, just briefly, in case people aren't fully aware, we have 3 clinics providing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy right now, Toronto, New York, and LA, hoping to expand much more broadly, also doing active work in drug development, as well as with psilocybin-producing mushrooms, really trying to advance knowledge, bring forward new products, a new way of thinking about this kind of care and these kind of therapies. From a commercialization perspective, and how do you control against the ills of a capitalist system? The answer is the same answer I give when people ask questions about how do we honor the heritage of psychedelic molecules and the indigenous roots and all that kind of stuff. And the truth is, I don't know. I don't have a great answer. It's something that we have to constantly keep working towards and being conscious of and evolving. Within Field Trip, we attempted to become a B Corp actually, but the B Labs wouldn't certify us because they didn't have the metrics against which to assess companies. So we took what they would otherwise propose and actually embedded them in our articles of incorporation. So it shows our internal commitment to being very conscious operators within this sphere. But I don't know exactly how you save against the ills. I think the most important thing we can be doing, and I'm a big believer in map making, is trying to do it as we go and show the way. But I'm highly cautious about crafting too many regulations in advance, because like I said, I've only ever seen regulations lead to perverse outcomes and people trying to cheat the system. And so instead of trying to, create a whole bulwark of rules against an evil that may or may not exist, well, it does exist, but we don't know that it necessarily is going to infect or perpetrate within the evolution of the psychedelics industry. I think it's just important to actively work to support people who are doing this with the right intention. And we are going to make mistakes, and there are going to be trip ups, and that's going to happen. And I think what we need to do is just consciously, make sure that the people we're partnering with and the people we choose to work with are motivated by the right intentions. And if we can support people who are bringing the right ethics to it, even though there may be missteps along the way, that's the best way that I think we can step forward and evolve as an industry. And that's the lens that we're bringing to Field Trip. I know it's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but truthfully, I think it's the best answer that I can give right now.
Thank you, Yaron, and welcome. Delighted to have you.
Dude, thanks for having me.
Ronan, yeah. And Yaron, I gather that you are also in the investing side, so it'd be useful on the heels of those comments, if you would share what Novamind is and how you view the market evolving.
Absolutely, and glad to be here. Like Ronan, I'm directly participating in the commercialization of psychedelics, so to speak. So I'm the co-founder and chief executive of a company called Novamind. Novamind is essentially out to build the infrastructure that will be required for regulated psychedelics industry. So that's what I meant by very much a participant in the commercialization of the psychedelic space. Echoing the sentiments, both Ronan and Liana as well, that I think there is a paradigm shift, certainly in the capital markets and the way people view people's views in terms of financing and capitalizing businesses and models in this space. And much like you've seen a different view and new ideas on old models specific to drug development when it comes from groups like MAPS or USONA, and certainly on the policy side, I think on the commercialization side, you'll see the same. So Novamind is out to do just that. We're a group of like-minded individuals. What we've done is we've sought out to partner with the thought leaders and the leading practitioners in the space. And that's how we intend to go about doing our part, at least to help them build this infrastructure. Specifically, we've partnered in the state of Utah with a psychiatrist, a thought leader in the space named Dr. Reed Robison. Dr. Robison has been practicing KAP, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, for a number of years now, and very successfully so. And he does that from 4 clinics in the greater Salt Lake area. Looking to build on the protocols and the success, the efficacy he's had with patients, we've partnered with him, and essentially we're there to provide the resources to help him both scale the protocols and the therapies, but of course access as well, access to those therapies. The second thing we've done is look to build an infrastructure and partner with people in the retreat space. So one of the investments we made is in a group called the Synthesis Institute, which I'm sure most of the people on the line are familiar with. And in fact, that was one of the first investments and partnerships we sought out, because again, we were seeking out the people who were in fact treating people today and looking to build upon their shoulders and supplement them with what they need to get to this new commercialized model. The third thing we do along with clinics and retreats is clinical research. And again, a lot of that goes back to Dr. Reed Robison, and I can talk about in some detail later. He is involved directly with MAPS, in fact, on their clinical trial work, among other clinical trials, and a number of experimental and IRB-approved studies that, you know, at their core, seek to provide alternative treatments to people who are desperate for them. So, in a nutshell, that's what Novamind is. You know, my view, just to answer the question, Seth, is that, you know, candidly, I'm pretty excited. Like Ronan, I get asked very often, you know, what does this economic model look like? What does the commercialization of psychedelics look like? And, you know, people speak to me that essentially it should be incumbent that answer is there. And I wholeheartedly agree with Ronan in a similar position. Maybe it's misery loves company, but I don't feel the need to distill that model today. We're working very, very hard at it. We've aligned with like-minded people. We're building on the shoulders of giants. I say that candidly. I think on this conversation, you know, hopefully in this conversation, I'll also be building on the shoulders of the giants on the call. So we're not starting from zero. We don't have to, you know, have it all figured out today. We've taken meaningful steps to provide people who in many cases have treatment-resistant conditions. I personally, just to, I guess, speak about myself as an individual beyond the organization and the group that we're building, you know, I'm informed by my life experience. I'm 41 years old, and I've certainly seen a lot to date, and in terms of real suffering, and I think that a lot of that suffering is needless. So my focus and certainly part of my agenda and intention for building a business in this new paradigm that we're here to talk about is that there's an opportunity to to affect meaningful change. I stand, before you on this call. That's an opportunity in of itself. I work with a like-minded group of people who, as I said, are working very diligently to figure out this model. That's an opportunity in itself. And I think, it's the right time, the right place. Liana as well alluded to it. Rick, of course, has for many years, but the zeitgeist has changed. There's a palpable sense. I've had the opportunity to speak with Phil on a number of occasions about his work in ketamine, related to Novamind's specific work focused on KAP. So, here exists the opportunity for an energized group of thoughtful people to take the best of what we've learned and the best resources available to us and do it right.
Great.
Misery loves company and the same haircut too, Yaron.
Thanks, Yaron. Jeffrey, delighted to have you. It's nice to have a perspective from a practitioner as well. So thanks for joining.
Thank you, Seth. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's interesting to hear all the perspectives. And I feel grateful to be in the room with everybody. I think, let me see. I think it's best for me to start actually about how I got to where I've gotten to and then explain what I'm doing as opposed to the other way around. When I went to college up at UC Berkeley, started in 1988, I felt this kind of loss of connection to what felt like a closeness to God, I think. I didn't really have all that language at the time, but I felt like something was happening in my neurology. It really felt like almost like a poison setting in development. And I found that psilocybin really kind of transformed that. It showed me to some extent what was going on in terms of, the diminishment in my sense of what was possible and kind of opened my mind back up. And I set my mind to understanding that, what was going on, both what was going on in terms of the poison, but also what this cure was, why did this work so effectively? I ended up studying mysticism. I went to the religious studies department, ended up becoming friends with Houston Smith over the years and studied mysticism in great detail. And when I went to medical school, I had the incredible luck, I feel personally, to have had the chance to try ketamine, and I immediately felt like I very gently walked right through the liminal door into the space I'd been studying for years and years. And what I found so profound about it was how gentle it was. I appreciate gentleness in general. I do believe that the psychedelics and the intensity and the having to submit to some extent to let go, to go with what's happening is a very powerful aspect to why they heal so much so fast. But I found that the kind of more yin nature of the ketamine experience was very profound for me, and also the potential of it for humans was very profound. And I set myself to studying it in depth. And over the years, I ended up trying to map the neurobiology of the NMDA receptor and the control over consciousness with the GABAergic interneuron net, kind of the inhibitory tone that kind of maintains scope of consciousness. And that's how I got to kind of understanding ketamine. One day, a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, I realized that a lot of the wonkiness in terms of ketamine delivery could be solved with a subcutaneous formulation of ketamine that could be delivered with an insulin-like pump device. What's an advantage to this is that you'd have high bioavailability, have extreme control over dosing, very exquisite control over dosing, and you would also be able to administer this outside of the medical environment, and that would provide a new, basically, ketamine treatment platform, a new system of delivering ketamine. Here we are, about 3 years into this project. So I am the Chief Science Officer for Bexon Biomedical. And our current project that we are looking at is bringing this subcutaneous formulation, new formulation of ketamine to market in conjunction with a patch pump, disposable wearable patch pump that would, our first indication would be for post-operative pain. The use case being somewhere between 3 to 10 days of use in order to help patients to avoid the need or reduce the need for opioid medication in post-operative care. Your larger question, which is commercialization, what do we do with profit motive? What is so appealing about this for me and why this is our strategy is that we can bring this product to market in an acute indication which requires lower doses of ketamine and has such a massive market that the monetization will allow us to keep the product cost at a lower level. Our current model that we're using for our financial projections has us offering treatment dosing of ketamine that's about a third of what Janssen has come to. And that is partly because there's such a large market. So I would make that specific argument that sometimes large markets and commercialization, if the thinking is aligned with the public health, solving public health problems, it actually can be a huge advantage. And that is what we are trying to do at Bexon.
Beautiful, thank you. And last but not least, Jamie, it's interesting, following up on Jeffrey's comments and alluding to Houston Smith. I know in your most recent article that I've read, you mentioned one of the musings of Houston Smith about whether we can ever turn our passing illuminations into abiding light. Think about the use case and some of the risks I know that you've identified or concerns that you have about the entire prospect of commercialization of psychedelics. It's an interesting transition for you to introduce yourself and apropos of the new book you're working on. So welcome.
Yeah, man, thanks. And a huge hat tip, first of all, Phil, Rick, Ethan, you feel like Dharma uncles who were breaking trail decades ahead. We were fucking around in high school and college.
Jamie, can you increase your sound, please?
I don't know. How's this? Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, thank you guys, truly, for the work back long before it was hip and long before there was any guarantee of success. And just as a quick introduction, I wrote a book a few years ago called Stealing Fire. It sort of documented some of these things. It came out a little bit before Pollen and was a little bit more of an insider take on the kind of neuroanthropology of altered states. And I'm currently writing the sequel to that called Recapture the Rapture, and which is basically what is an open source toolkit? What's the psycho-spiritual equivalent to blockchain, basically? And I'm working on the assumption that the psychedelic renaissance is doomed, dead on arrival, that it's awesome and it's beautiful and will absolutely be captured by market forces. There will absolutely be a race to the bottom. We will see all of the things that we're already glimpsing, and it's going to play out pretty much exactly like we'd be concerned. And that's okay. You know, that is sort of in the realm of sort of the Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction. This is the next chapter of the Promethean Act. It is I mean, Rick, you made the highly strategic, very effective Faustian bargain of 30 years ago seeking medical approval and access, and absolute love, appreciation, and hat tips. And what has it done now is that it's spitting the product out into the waiting arms of big pharma and venture capital. Where if we had gone a sacramental approval route, or we had done something else, it would be into a different place. It would be into, pedo priests. There would be a whole other set of clusterfucks, but it would be basically around the realm of what is the soul of the congregant having a sacrament versus what is the lifetime recurring revenue of a customer. And those are strong forces, and they're not of our making. John Mackey was a mentor of ours. He lives here in Austin, and he was telling the story of the starting of Whole Foods way back when at this little funky store, 1986, whenever it was, and it was Birkenstocks and carob and bulgur in bulk. you know, and if you could take any of them and teleport them to today, where you've got your Tesla charging stations and you've got $12 a pound artisanal goat cheese, you know, they would scream. They would say, oh my God, that is an abomination of everything that we held near and dear. And at the same time, Whole Foods became worldwide market makers of organic produce and sustainable farming, and then also goaded Walmart into now becoming the biggest organic producer, you know, in North America. So you're like, okay, so there's going to be a lot of creative destruction, and the outcome is rarely going to look like what the revolutionaries hoped or dreamed. And I don't even know. That just feels like a WYSIWYG kind of thing. I think that's just going to be the way it plays, and we should wrap our heads around it. And at the same time, my sense is that the underground, Phil, that you spoke to, you know, will continue to be necessary. It will continue to be vital to be the keepers of a flame, who are separate from all those market forces, who are extending deep relationships. And the final thing I'll just say now, because I'm much more curious about our shared conversation, is the other unintended consequence of going the medical route is that we're cramming hyperdimensional starlight into three-dimensional business models and psychologies. And we're like, oh, excitatory glutamate receptor sites, you know, like study shows something on depression. And you're like, is that really what's going on here, folks? Because we've ripped it out of cultural context. And if you think about the power of cultural context, it's like how great-great-great-great-grandpa rubbed two sticks together, and we don't have to fucking figure out how to do that again. You know, things get handed down. There's learnings and there's lessons. And as long as it's within the medical clinical model of depression, trauma, anxiety, whatever, and I'm coming to fix you, but no one's going to tell them about the bats. You know, it's fear and loathing all over again. Like, how do we actually architect transformational and transpersonal culture such that there are modes of meaning and understanding, and therefore the hallowed integration that actually incorporates the sacred and incorporates the domains that are getting disclosed in these experiences willy-nilly, but never show up in the papers. Or if they do, it's known as excess ideation, you know, and we just sweep a shit pile under that rug. So the question of how do we do this going forwards, and what does a psychedelic culture look like? I think is critical, both in an ontological sense. I mean, and MAPS, you guys have done amazing jobs on the kind of hands-off harm reduction facilitation, like don't make meaning for people, don't lean into their suggestive states, don't do all those things. And in a harm reduction stance, that is perfect and beautiful and highly ethical and needed. And at some point, we've all got like these baskets on our back of like all the whack-ass shit we've been seeing, and we need to make sense of it all and integrate it into an updated transformational culture. And we're not very good at it. Like if we can tell the Plandemic and QAnon crowds, like you don't want that. You don't want to sprinkle psychedelics onto those mimetic viruses. We need much more rigorous sense-making and much more rigorous ethics of concern and care. But that requires us to actually acknowledge there's a there. And as long as we're keeping our cards close to our vest and doing it scientifically and business-wise, we are not actually acknowledging the mystery at the heart of these experiences. And I think that, to me, that's an even greater concern than the business models, which we can kind of just anticipate will play how they do. It's the question of how do we become keepers of the sacred and carry it forward into transformational culture that actually holds and supports everyone in the maelstrom of social and political and climactic grief, and keeps this pointing straight down the middle for all humans, versus getting factionalized, fragmented, and weaponized. I mean, it's, you know, the classic example is the Aztec priest tripping balls on mushrooms and ripping out the beating hearts of their sacrifices. You know, like there's no guarantees that this isn't just the ring of power. And it isn't just elves and hobbits that are curious about it.
Seth, I wonder if I could just take off on one of the earlier points that Jamie made. Would that be okay?
Please.
You know, it's thinking on that issue about how the medicalization of psychedelics relates to the use of the psychedelics beyond the medical, right? For whatever one wants. And I know Rick's very conscious about this, but, you know, it made me think a fair bit about some of the challenges we confronted when we first started moving towards legalization of medical marijuana back in 1996, the first successful ballot initiative in California back then. And what I remember was when I and a few of the other leaders of this thing were doing that, we really were saying we had two reasons for focusing on medical marijuana now, on basically ending the prohibition of marijuana for medical purposes. The first was our belief that those people who needed it medically deserved to be first in line in order to obtain access in a legal way. And the second was our hope and supposition, based upon some research, but not conclusive, that in moving forward on the legitimization of marijuana as a medicine, that would help reduce over the long term the opposition to broader legalization for all adults outside the medical thing, right? And it was interesting. I remember getting hit from two sides on that. One was my friend back then, Thomas Seth, the libertarian-minded anti-psychiatry psychiatrist, right? And he would condemn me, you know, in very robust terms for legitimizing the medical establishment. He saw the medical hierarchy as even more severe than the criminal justice one, and we were giving them all the power over this thing. And on the other side were the sort of medical marijuana purists who said, you know, Ethan, this should just be about medical marijuana. It's just about the patients. We don't care at all about the broader legalization of this sort of stuff, right? And I remember just thinking that, well, you know, no, we're going to stick with our dual belief here, that there's an ethical argument for patients being first in line, and that we do think it'll lead to a broader opening. And there was some concern from a strategic element that if we peeled off the most sympathetic victims of prohibition, which were the patients, all that would be left would be the recreational users, and then we would stall broader legalization. Well, it turned out, fortunately, we were right, and we actually saw in subsequent polling that, in fact, people who knew somebody who used marijuana medically were the most likely to support the broader legalization, even more so than people with personal experience, right? So there was the strategic sensibility around this stuff. And when I look at all the emphasis on the medical, and you say when Rick made the Faustian, you know, deal on going the medical way rather than the religious way, and right, we had some of that same debate with religious versus medical in terms of marijuana, and the people who pursued the religious line, they landed up in jail in Hawaii and places like that. We never got any.
I think it was the savvy move. I think it was
so widely used. But on the medical side, it seems to me that what is happening on the medical side, and maybe this is some antidote for even some of the fears around commercialization, is that by legitimizing and with all of this growing amount of awareness out there as a result of Matt's work and all of your guys' work and then Michael Pollan's book and all of these sorts of things, people are losing more generally their fears around psychedelics. And that'll lead to more innovative, thoughtful treatments with the psychedelics, you know, with the clinical and the psychotherapy and all that. But it'll also open up the space and reduce the fears and prohibitions around people using that outside the formal therapeutic context in a way that may be beneficial and therapeutic in its own right. And because at least some of these substances, obviously with marijuana, we had a modest issue around quality control, right? Around marijuana as being grown illegally versus legally. It is a real issue, but it was not a major issue. With psychedelics, it's obviously more of an issue. Mushrooms is its own separate thing, but with the synthetic substances, it's more of an issue. So, you know, I don't know how that piece plays out there, but I just wanted to throw out that kind of, you know, comparative perspective from the history of medical marijuana and broader marijuana legalization.
If I may make some comments as a clinician, there are splits in all of this, which we're sort of talking about, but not really. The work we're doing with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy or MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is about helping people who are in great emotional distress. We're treating people within a positive psychotherapeutic environment that's never been created before. And we need for those people who are masses of people, remember this whole thing with ketamine came about because 40% or more of people were not treatable for terrible depression, for treatment-resistant depression. That's an obligation we have to provide a kind of quality of care that's rigorous, thoughtful, wrapped around the particular nature of the psychedelic medicines we use. And it's a psychotherapeutic strategy. It needs to be adopted within the entire spectrum of medical care. If we go to Europe, where we just did a talk with Rupert McShane that Jeffrey sponsored, the National Health Service is available to take that on to some extent, though they medicalize it like Prozac. There's, of course, a secondary market for that kind of treatment outside National Health Service. But a lot of what we're talking about separately is, in terms of commercialization, is the aberration of our not having a National Health Service or insurance coverage of any adequacy to cover psychotherapeutic care. So that means that there is an alternative strategy going on of supersize, of great proportion, that's outside of the medical therapeutic alliance. So someone who's going to get charged, you know, $200 for the medicine that Rick's going to prescribe with a treatment organization that's going to cost in our society somewhere around $1,500 or more dollars, can go on the street and, if they're lucky, buy pure MDMA for $25 or ketamine for $25 and completely circumvent the treatment strategy because they can't afford it. They have no access. And there's, of course, interest in psychedelic experiences, which is a profound interest. So the commercialization, in a sense, is just an aspect because we do not have a national health service. That's not to say that Europeans don't generate profit from pharma, et cetera. But the embeddedness for a methodology that is really new, successful, we generated it back in the 80s and even before as a strategy to help human beings with their emotional difficulties and to embed them within their connective circles, their communities. That's what I think we're really about. To the extent that commercialization strategies undercut that and pretend to be or are partly, because some are only pretending to be, to the extent that that is occurring as a methodology that's partial, it needs to become more robust. It's hard for me to get behind just giving ketamine in small ways to people that aren't backed by the fact that it is a powerful psychedelic, that it has powerful impact on human beings, and that it needs to be followed and embedded in a full psychiatric strategy. So I think we're looking at things that are evolving, not always in a good direction, because you know, everything that FDR tried for has sort of gone away, and the insurance industry here predominates, and we need to have a way in which the quality of care becomes paramount. And all we can do and I think MAPS is trying to do it, we're trying to do it, is to set a best practices standard for how to use this in a medical setting. That means that others won't follow it, that others will undercut it. We've had imitators and people just taking our stuff and then sending it out as psychedelics into the world to people who are coming in ignorant of psychedelic medicine and using it in a very haphazard way. I can't get behind that. So while I'm all for development and commercialization, I want it to be rigorous and I want it to be thoughtful. And I wanted to represent people's needs.
Well, as another clinician, I would say that there's something, I think that's something important just to clarify in everything that you're saying, which is that, you know, I don't make a lot of money off of ketamine. I think there's this misperception that ketamine clinics, you know, are making a ton of money. They are not, especially if they're high touch clinics. Like if I spend 2 or 2.5 hours with a patient, it's really mission driven. I actually lose money on that time. And that's even when I get what would be relatively considered a full fee for my time by hour. I can make much more money with half-hour visits and med visits and med refills and that kind of thing. And they're actually less stressful, honestly. So it's more stress, less money. And that's pretty much even when people are paying full price. So this is what's driving a lot of the innovations that people are having trouble with, which is that it doesn't pay. And I'm not sure what the solution to that is, but I do think it's important for people to understand this is not a bunch of predatory doctors out here. The ones I know, everybody basically agrees that you lose money on a ketamine practice right now.
There was an interesting article, just as an aside, that says ketamine is not good for profits.
Well, just to interject here. I'm curious, Ronan or Yaron, who are looking at this from an investor standpoint. Is there a continuum or a segmentation of the market that you've done that you could share to help us understand what the profit model looks like? And that's one question number one. Question number two is, I gather that you're focused at least on Field Trip and the higher end delivery, but all of us, I think, are, and much of the audience is interested in not ring fencing that to only the very few that can afford $1,500 a session or more. Is there a model that allows for access to care while maintaining standards that would actually be profitable?
Yeah, I mean, our price point, just so everyone has the full context, is a course of treatment in our clinics is a total of 16 sessions, which involves an initial consultation with a psychiatrist and a physician to make sure that ketamine is appropriate and that medically and physically you're suitable. Then there's a total of 6 ketamine sessions. Each one is followed by what we're calling exploratory therapy, which is really, some may call it integration work. I don't know if I'd call it that, but it's really about helping people express and document their experience, what happened. Again, we're trying to lean into it. So our preferred course of treatment is using intramuscular, such that you have the most intense trip possible on a relatively small dose of ketamine. And so during those exploratory therapy sessions, it's really just about documenting your experience and expressing both the emotions, the physical, the insight, whatever happened. And so, of course, of treatment is you do ketamine session followed by exploratory, ketamine followed by exploratory, and then we do a non-ketamine integration session. And the whole course of 16 treatments is supposed to take place over roughly 3 weeks. And it's a total of $4,700. So that averages out to just under $300 per session. It's not priced like that, but that's where it's priced, which we consciously did because we wanted to make it competitive to cognitive behavioral therapy without ketamine, right? And the overall course of treatment. And so our pricing is substantially below ketamine infusion pricing. But the reason we're able to do that and still build margin, and this is where a lot of the lens of for-profit motivation came from, is we're focused on making sure that the high-value work is only done by the high-value providers, and everything else can be outsourced to people who are much lower cost. And so even in that model, we're estimating that we'll have about a 50% EBITDA margin on a 16-course treatment. So it's profitable. And even though $5,000 without question is a lot of money for a lot of people, on a per session basis, it's pretty in line with most cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's why we're kind of so excited about it, because we brought the lens of optimization without trying to sacrifice the quality of the experience. Now, there's always going to be a balance. It's going to be imperfect, and we'll probably swing too far one way and too far the other way, and we'll continue to work it out. But that's kind of the lens we've brought. And our fundamental belief is that even though that's still priced to a point that only a certain segment of society can reach right now, if we can show the efficacy, if we can show it successfully, you're going to engage insurance coverage, you're going to introduce more people into the market. And, maybe I'm a naive Canadian, or maybe I think a lot of the Americans in this conversation have a perception that capitalism is always ruthless, but I think that's a uniquely American form of capitalism that isn't necessarily reflected elsewhere. It certainly can be, but I think you can do this in a race to the top. I don't think all capitalism leads to a race to the bottom, especially, I think, as Yaron touched on, I think we're going in with a different context. I think we have a different attitude. I think so many questions, like this gets into a broader philosophical conversation, but so much of what our society has been built on is crumbling right before our eyes. We see the U.S. government basically imploding on itself. We see conversations around market economics and interest rates and all that kind of stuff, finding out, oh, we were wrong, right? All of the advice we've given around, nutrition and eating lots of carbs and low fat, oh, we were wrong. So many things are now up for grabs, and there's a great opportunity to bring a new lens to it. And I think that's where we come from on the perspective, is that you can still make a profit and do wonderfully and be net positive without creating that race to the bottom. And that's really where we're trying to position ourselves, is let's build a profitable business. Let's create impact. Let's show a lot of data and lead by example.
Liana, you had mentioned in your introduction how the work that you're doing with innovative ways to either raise money or finance. I'm curious if you would just expand a little bit upon that, the idea of how do we fund the growth in a way that isn't either fully profit maximizing, but also takes into account the fact that access to care is critical, and we may be a ways away from a robust insurance market that would facilitate that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, to Ronan's point, I think we are dealing with a very American form of capitalism that is, generally speaking, a race to the bottom and has perverse incentives embedded into it. And so that's a lot of what is being kicked up, I think, by this conversation, at least for me, is how do we mitigate the potential harm that can be created when those incentives are present. And one thing I'd actually just like to share is an alternative model for clinics and treatment centers. So I think what Ronan is promoting is kind of like what we could compare to a One Medical. Is everyone on here familiar with the One Medical model? So you have this standard of care, you know that you're going to get the same experience no matter what kind of clinic or center you walk into. And one thing I'd like to posit is that one of the challenges in ensuring that the most amount of people, especially communities that often have the least access to quality care, gain access to breakthrough and therapies and new therapies coming online and becoming available. And so this question of having culturally relevant and culturally competent centers where people can go in their own cities where they live and be with therapists that work within their communities and are sensitive to the needs of their communities. And so we're starting to see models take root. There's a couple of examples. One I'll point to is the Sage Clinic in Oakland, which also has a foundation attached to it, which has low cost and in some cases fully subsidized treatment options for people. Their therapists are the makeup of their staff represents the makeup of the city of Oakland in terms of demographics and backgrounds and things like that. And the other thing is, I think one of the sources of funding that might be more supportive to having this is a way more decentralized model. This is not a corporation owns a set of clinics. This is how do we empower communities to generate clinics that are appropriate to serve the communities that they're seeking to serve. And then how do we kind of generate a system that can support and fuel those individuals? I think to Jeffrey's point, a lot of the people I know, clinicians who have been working in ketamine therapists for years, people Phil knows as well, can say that this is not a huge money-making endeavor if you're doing it in this high touch, high care, maximizing the quality of care. And so I think a more supportive financial model for these clinics are low interest, long horizon loans. And I think generating pools of funds that understand that this is a new modality of treatment, that want to have community care centers that maybe offer psychedelic therapy, but potentially are also hooked in with a whole suite of other services, mental health services, health and nutrition services, things that can really look at holistic care for a person, places that might offer community or group integration, or at least, classes and courses around that. So places that are really part of the fabric of their communities. When we're talking about culture and what we would like to see take root, I'm really interested in not having this be for only those people that can't afford it. I understand that we need to make the case to insurance. I understand there's going to be demand for that, and there's going to be, a need for that, and there's potentially enough room for both models to exist simultaneously. But I'm really more focused on how this decentralized model, and then understanding what are the shared services that might be able to even be cooperatively owned. And I'm really inspired by the groups of people I've seen who are putting projects like this together, putting their energy together, understanding that if there's a critical mass of people who are seeking to do things differently, all working together, then we can create an alternative pathway forward beyond the ones that are preordained by our system as the way that it is, our pharmaceutical system and our healthcare systems. And then in terms of other alternative capital structures, I mean, there's a revolution happening right now in venture capital that I've been witnessing. I live in San Francisco. I'm not there right now, but I'm surrounded by people who are really thinking critically around the venture capital model, questioning the 2 and 20 model, asking why is this the terms? Why is this, the standard deal terms that every single person is presented and goes along with? And so these questions are being raised. There's different groups doing different things. And one other thing I'll say is I always point to companies like Patagonia and Dr. Bronner's and Guayaki Tea, who are exemplary models of how to do well while also doing good. All of these companies are extremely successful. All of them are doing great things for the world, and all of them treat their employees like gold. And so there is a way to do business differently. And the thing I really challenge is this notion that, oh, we need to do things a certain way because that's the way it's always been done. And so different investors, there's Obvious Ventures has the World Positive term sheet, which they're now requiring for any group that they present capital to. And yeah, there's a couple of other deals I hear in the works, and what we need are more primary examples of people doing things differently. OpenAI has a capped return investment model that's worth looking at as well. Seth,
You're on mute, Seth.
Oh, Bill, I know you've been an advocate for the model of supporting or building an alliance or coalition of practitioners and then supporting them and supporting the clinics. Is that a viable model, and how much capital does that require per clinic?
Well, you know, what we've been doing is called the Ketamine Psychotherapy Associates Group. We're now up to over 60 practitioner members. It's not terribly different, I think, than what MAPS is trying to do. That is to generate practices of that are supported by ongoing culture, ongoing training, ongoing discussion of evolving methodology. That's a membership organization. It's not capital intensive. And you know, there are no salaries really. And so it's something that we grow as people come into the capability of practicing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. We'd like to build alliances with that, with MAPS and other organizations, and we're building a worldwide perspective called Indra's Net Coalition, which is an attempt to build a very broad-scale worldwide trauma treatment coalition. But I think the membership model, there is a membership for ketamine group called the ASKP, which is evolving. And I think the more MAPS and we are doing an ethics modeling, because ethics for both overground and underground using alternative substances is of great importance, and there have been ethical violations, and we need to really maintain a sense of what is appropriate behavior, what is good behavior, what is not. And so there is a responsivity, I think, that we're making to address the major issues confronting us. I think the financial issue remains an open issue and a difficult one. So this has been a good discussion for me. I wonder, Rick, what you would want to contribute to this.
Well, yeah, I wanted to say, in response to what you had said before about how, you know, people can go on their own and get it for $25 instead of going, you know, to get it from the practitioners, that I think we need to be in favor of both of those things simultaneously. You know, that we want to make it so that people have as much education to do this on their own through legal access to these substances. And at the same time, if they want help, then they'll go to the clinics, and then they'll presumably and hopefully have insurance coverage for that. So that I think one of the concerns I have about commercialization is that there is a way where that undercuts the model. And so I would be concerned that commercialization advocates, you know, Yaron from Mind Medicine said he wants nothing to do with those kind of people that want to decriminalize drugs, that we should see that there's enough people that are suffering sufficiently that are going to want to go to the clinics. And at the same time, we need more of this kind of mass mental health and permit people to do that themselves. The other thing is that, sort of following on what Liana said, is that this idea of ownership of multiple clinics, that's one model, and I think there is some value to that. But what we're trying to do is more local ownership, so that the thought is that while we will train all the therapists and they will be setting up clinics, we want them to have, we're not trying to raise capital so that we have 100 or 200 or 1,000 MAPS clinics. And we also want the clinics to be, people cross-trained again with ketamine, psilocybin, MDMA, and other things. So I think it's just a different approach, and we'll make our money. I guess we're different in the sense that from Field Trip, at least so far, is that we're actually working for a pharmaceutical product that we will make the money selling that, whether we own the clinics or not. And we're not really trying to maximize the money, but it's just another way to get the donor. So the access to capital question you said, Seth, is that there's so much need. There's so many potential uses of not just MDMA, but other psychedelics, that if we continually went to philanthropic contributions, that it would be hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. But eventually, if we can make a source of income from the sale of MDMA, then we can put it into other uses. And
so along those lines, Rick, one of the great things I think that the clinical studies that you've been doing, we've been doing, and Hefter, et cetera, have been doing, is that we're getting out information about what hazards there are, what qualities there are, the nature of the experiences to the broad public. And I think that's been a really important part, in addition to proving the worthwhileness so that it can be prescribed. We're also showing to people how to use best practices, set and setting, and all of that. And I think it's making a big difference.
Yeah, and our Zendo project, the psychedelic harm reduction that we do at festivals and elsewhere, it's about educating people to offer peer support to each other, basically for free. And it's another way to bring the kind of therapeutic principles into more wider practice outside of strict medical situations.
And perhaps we can encourage our commercializing good friends here to contribute to an educational process involved in reaching out to the public in general.
And Ronan, I just want to say one thing really quickly, is that you said that, you may be different than us because you don't think psychedelics are essential for human evolution. So I agree that the psychedelics are not essential. We could be having this conversation by mailing letters to each other and eventually publishing it in a journal, but we decided to use Zoom.
Yep. No, absolutely.
Psychedelics are more like Zoom. They're not essential. They need to be by other practices. But yeah, just want to clarify that.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And like that's totally my perspective, which is like, I think they're a great amplifier of work we could be doing. But I think there's a perspective amongst a broader community that people within the psychedelic community believe that they're a panacea. And like, I think one of the things we can do all together is like maintain a whole degree of objectivity. And even to like some of Jamie's points, which is like, the coach I work with for 15 years, he has no degree, he has no clinical training, he's got nothing. He is just a deeply empathetic person that can do wonderful things and open your eyes to a whole sense of perspective that isn't, that you don't see for yourself. And I think he's more qualified to do, psychedelic therapies than most of the therapists or psychologists I've met. And so I'm all for, and even at Field Trip, we're all for all sorts of modalities, because like even if we hit every one of our business targets, we can't help nearly enough people. And if at the end of the day we manage to cure depression through our clinics and we solve this whole problem and we don't have a business anymore, there's no one on our team will be, oh, that's a shame, right? We're all kind of in this for good reasons, and we support all the different modalities that are coming to this, because it's all, even though there's a profit motive built into our business, the underlying philosophy of what we're doing is really trying to create positive impact. And we're just using a particular model. It's not the only model, and we certainly don't want it to be exclusive to alternative approaches to it, because they're all going to be impactful to creating, I think, the best outcomes possible.
Well, as the elder in the group, mind expansion with psychedelics is certainly a wonderful aspect of it, but it has to be embedded in an overall life constructive operation, which is spiritual, emotional, connective, and generates love and sharing and community. Otherwise, it's taking substances for the hell of substances, which is fun, but it's not enough.
Totally. One of the questions that came up internally on our side, so our doctor, one of our doctors in our LA clinic, Randy, he asked the question, he's like, are any of your therapists qualified do you help someone if they have like an experience with God in any of their trips? And the answer is like, I'm not actually sure, because they're very trained clinically and academically, but to transcend into actually helping someone through that experience, I mean, that's, you know, that's what I want to get to. Like, I'm coming from a deeply spiritual side of this as well. And it's like, these are all really interesting, challenging, you know, important questions and things we're all working towards, even though I'm the first to admit I have no idea what the answers are, except we're trying to get there with, you know, our heads up and our minds open and working hard to come up with good answers.
Well, as we approach the end of our 90 minutes, I think it would be useful for the audience if we talked a little bit about timelines. And Rick, I mean, we're lucky that ketamine is a approved medicine with psychedelic properties today. Rick, I would wonder if you could just talk about your projection on timing for when MDMA or psilocybin, and then maybe the perspective for other substances in the future, and what the timeline looks like.
Well, the timeline is deeply impacted by COVID. And so we have, you know, as I mentioned, 15 sites, 2 in Israel, 2 in Canada, and 11 in the United States. And we've opened up 5 of those sites for our second phase 3 study. And we hope by the end of the year, we'll have about 10 of them open. So we're currently projecting near the end of 2022, middle to the end of 2022, where we'll have FDA approval if the data is sufficient. Could even be early 2023, depending on how long it takes to really enroll the next group of 100 people in the second phase 3 study. What we're thinking is that Europe is going to be about a year behind. That'll depend on fundraising for us. We do have to raise another 30 million for globalization, focused mostly on Europe. And then most countries will accept data from FDA in Europe and not require any new studies. I think psilocybin is probably, they're not yet in phase 3. So they're probably 2023, I would guess. That's probably Compass first. USONA, I think, is maybe a little bit slower. Maybe Compass be beginning 2023. The others will be the end of 2023. We're planning a new big psychedelic science conference. We're anticipating something like, we're hoping for like 10,000 people. This would be in April of 2023. And so we want that to be sort of new of what it's going to look like. And I think there's going to be a bit of time to get insurance coverage. We're not sure how quickly that will happen, but we are doing cost effectiveness studies right now. We're doing a lot of data gathering about healthcare utilization of people. We're about to start a long-term follow-up, very long-term, to our phase 2 studies that some people have taken MDMA 15 years ago. So we'll be able to track their healthcare utilization. And I don't anticipate any regulatory blockages. You know, the way that we saw a backlash in the 60s, I don't see that happening right now. I think it's too embedded in the culture now, and it's not so much linked to counterculture protests. So I would say that in the next couple of years, we should be starting to see approval for prescription use. We're also, 30 years we've been trying since 1990 to start research inside the Veterans Administration with MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. We're anticipating hearing soon from the FDA about a study at the Bronx VA. The FDA has already approved a study at the Loma Linda VA, as have their own IRB. So I think even the Veterans Administration is moving to adopt this. I think the federal government is the last to change. So when we'll actually have like NIMH funding for these kind of things, may be a while, but I think it's coming. And you know, I don't want to prejudge what our researchers are actually going to say. We really have to prove safety and efficacy. But we will know by the end of September, as I said, whether our first phase 3 study was statistically significant. And if that's the case, then I think chances are 2022 is when we'll have approval.
Seth, if I may, to conclude this, I want to talk about the wrapper that we're all in. So this is all going to come into the infiniteplaya.com, which I'm proud to say is the production of my son, now known as Helix Wolfson. And we're doing a week of programming. We're going to be with this panel on Sunday the 6th, but this is the virtual burn, because the burn won't occur for COVID reasons. We start at 10 o'clock on August 31st, Monday, we end up with the temple burn, the virtual temple burn, which is at the end of Sunday the 6th. We have almost continuous programming. I think you'll find it really interesting and hope you'll join us for that. It's a week-long convention, basically, and I think you'll find it really exciting and interesting, so I hope you will join us.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing your avatar in the K-Dome.
Thanks so much, Seth.
Take care.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for inviting us,
Thanks,
guys.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful.